Hello and welcome to Dead Air Live for November 17th, 2015. I'm Joe Lynch. Our guests on this episode are members of the Fossil Free Somerville organization, and it is my pleasure to welcome them to Dead Air Live. Our members tonight are Eric Fields, Samantha Akiha, and Joe Saki. I want to thank you all for sitting here patiently waiting for us to start. So welcome to Dead Air Live.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Great to
Tonight, they've asked me to host some of these things, but this subject is going to be fascinating for me. Sometimes you lose the host when you start talking about things, but there's a movement underway. That movement is to eliminate the use of fossil fuels for running our planet. Basically, that's what the movement is. Mm-hmm. I'm going to ask each of you in turn to just describe a little bit about yourselves, and it gives the viewers kind of a picture of why you're involved in that type of organization. So, Eric, why don't you take it away?
I am a graduate student at Tufts. I've lived here in Somerville for 7 years, and a few years ago, I just felt like it was important to get involved in something around climate change because it's such an important issue and not enough is being done. And I found this organization through meeting Sam, actually, and I've been involved the last couple of years.
Great. Thanks. Samantha?
Let's see. I've lived in Somerville for about 3 years, and I've worked on climate issues for a while now. I started when I was in college in the area, and to me it's all about the future generations when I think about having kids or my grandkids. Even though I'm not at that stage in my life right now, it's what I think about all the time, and it's just about preserving this country and the world for people, here in Somerville and all over the world. So that's my main motivation.
Samantha. And Joe?
I am also a graduate student at Tufts in the Urban and Environmental Policy and Planning program. I had been involved in some sort of limited climate activism in undergrad, but was more interested in it in an intellectual capacity or just kind of general interest. But it really does feel like a very urgent and pressing issue, and so I was looking for a way to get involved on a more local scale, and I was introduced to Fossil Free Somerville from one of my friends from undergraduate as well, and so I've been involved for the last few years.
Okay. And Joe, how old is the organization here, Fossil Free Somerville?
The organization began in roughly late 2012, I believe.
Just about 3 years.
Yeah, so right around, we're approaching the 3-year mark from the genesis of the organization, and have been doing work continuously since then on a number of different fronts.
Great. So tonight's program, I think if we give the viewers some background on the movement globally, nationally, locally, I think that's going to be helpful to them. The other reason, one of the reasons when people hear an organization wants a local organization to change the way they do business, it's kind of, there's a little bit of hesitancy, who are these outside organizations? But I think because you folks have the background, you know the policies, you know the stats, you know the numbers, you know climate change, I'm going to let you kind of guide us through that conversation tonight. One of the things I do want to make clear is that everything that we talk about tonight, the City of Somerville itself, its leaders, the Mayor Joe Curtatone, the Board of Aldermen, and many of the individual aldermen are all behind the movement that you guys are part of. So let's take it from there, and then we'll start talking about the Somerville Retirement Board and what your efforts are in trying to get them to divest. So, Eric, let's start with you. The movement started maybe sometime in the 90s. There was the genesis of climate change, global warming. The names seem to change, and they're very, very fluid. Give us a little bit of a background about why organizations like Fossil Free Somerville started.
Yeah, sure. So I think that people still really started talking about the problem of global warming at the international level going back to maybe the 80s, the late 80s or early 90s. The first international climate meetings were held. People started saying this is a problem we need to address. And here we are, 25 plus years later, and not nearly enough has been done, and we're just getting closer and closer to a point of no return, essentially. And so I think what we've seen over the last 5 to 10 years is increasing numbers of organizations like ours ordinary people saying we need to do something, we need to build a movement to try and push this because we don't see our leaders doing it on their own.
And define fossil fuels for the viewers who are going to watch this program. It's not just oil.
Right. Also, coal, natural gas, anything of that sort. Basically, fuels that emit carbon dioxide when they're burned.
And it's mainly the fuels that we're taking out of the earth.
Yes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So, Samantha, we'll get a little bit more into some of the other national movements, but you're now working in the field, not just a grad student. No offense, guys, but you're working in the field. Tell us a little bit more about the work that you do.
Yeah, well, professionally I work for an organization called the Union of Concerned Scientists, and we work on a number of issues, but one of our big focuses is climate change and renewable energy. And we currently are doing a lot of work around Obama's Clean Power Plan, which is the first time that the Environmental Protection Agency has put regulations on power plant emissions, which is super exciting. And so now we're taking it to the next step of working with states on an individual level and helping them comply with the new regulations and making sure that they have the highest percentage of renewables possible. So that's what we do at UCS, and it's interesting. I've had a lot of experience working, within Massachusetts on different state level campaigns, and now for a national organization. But to be honest, I've found the work that I do in Somerville to be the most rewarding because, as Eric was saying, it really is from the bottom up that we have to do this, and just the lack of leadership at the national and international level. Although we've made some progress in that area, it's really ultimately up to individuals to do what they can, and this is our way of doing that.
And Joe, what kind of support are you seeing here from the average Joe on the street?
Well, I think that climate change as an issue is very much kind of at the, if not the forefront of people's minds, they're at least aware of it. But typically, it seems like such kind of an internationally caused problem and kind of a global problem that the average Joe, as a Joe myself, doesn't necessarily know where to start or how it can be affected at the local level. And so I think people are excited when they hear about the fact that there's something they can do in their community, in their neighborhood, and with the people that they know to combat this problem that at times seems really overwhelming. So I would say that the vast majority of people that I've spoken with doing our petition gathering and at events that we've hosted has been very positive.
And going back, Eric, I know that you were quoted in many of the local media pages back in February, I think it was. Is that when the hearing was up at Somerville City Hall?
Yeah, in front of the Board of Aldermen. Yeah.
In front of the board.
Yeah.
I'm gonna look to our director. Do we have a clip of that, of the Board of Aldermen hearing that you'd like to play?
Which hearing?
So it was a hearing in front of the Board of Aldermen on fossil fuel divestment.
Yeah, it was
And
a
this
hearing
was
that we
February 2014.
It was March 2014,
Yeah, March,
actually,
yeah.
so close. But yeah, it was a public hearing that was held in response to signatures that we submitted to the city.
Is this the Patricia Wild clip?
Yes.
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 Yeah?
Yes, we do have that. And we can play that.
I think we might be rolling that clip now.
Alrighty.
We're rolling that clip, yes.
Good evening. My name is Patricia Wild. I live at 25 School Street. And before I begin, I want to say that since the last time I addressed this horseshoe, I see some familiar faces and I see some new faces, and hello to all of you. I am a former teacher at Somerville's Exalted Scale program, and therefore am a recipient of a pension that shows up magically every first of the month in my checking account. So when I heard about this, I did my homework, and as has been referenced by several people here this evening, yes, the carbon bubble is going to burst. And so as a pensioner, I urge you to divest, because I think that this is not a wise use of the money. But as a pensioner, that also makes me, like many pensioners, a grandmother. And I am anticipating a conversation with my granddaughter Lillian, who at the moment is 1.5 years and spends her Mondays exploring Somerville's parks. Conway's her favorite so far, but there are many more for her to discover. Thank you. I see her 15, 20 years from now turning to me and saying, Grandma, you knew that for this to be a livable planet, there had to be 350 parts per million, and by 2014, it rose to 4,000. What did you do? Good question. So I'm going to tell her about tonight, and I'm going to tell her about a amazing experience that many of us shared a few years ago over in Somerville High School while a World Series was going on, and we were there in support of a Green Line. I'm going to tell her about how we, as people who cared about this planet, realized at about the time she was born that if something was going to change about our dependency on fossil fuels, it was only going to happen on the local level. And that's why her mom, who, by the way, is named Hope, was raised in Somerville to be an activist herself, and that good things happened. I'll tell her that night in 2005, when we urged the Green Line to come here, was the first time that I heard the words environmental justice. It was the first time I heard that Somerville's cancer and asthma rates were off the charts. And I'm going to tell her, well, she's going to tell me, thank you, Grandma. Thanks for doing the right thing. Thank you.
They're being cautious about divesting from any of the portfolio without running it by the powers that be. One of the things I did notice on the Somerville Retirement Board's website was a letter, an opinion letter, that came back from the Massachusetts Retirement Board, cautioning them against divesting from any type of investment based on outside pressure or something that could be perceived by the retirees as a less than prudent investment. So can we, Joe, you want to take that and talk about the implications of that?
Sure. And so I think that by nature the retirement board tends towards kind of a conservative position, as Eric said, for some good reason. They do want to make sure that they're doing right by the retirees, and I think that kind of logic extrapolates to the state regulatory agency, where they tend to a more conservative position. But I think if you look at it in a broader context, it's somewhat misguided. The logic is that if you limit the universe of investment options, then you just less is by definition less, and so they want kind of the more options there are, the more opportunity there are for returns. But if you look at the trend in fossil fuel company value, both in the relatively short term over the past number of years and in the much longer term, where fossil fuels are by definition a finite resource and are going to run out, there really is a financially prudent argument in favor of divestment, and I think that's being ignored, especially by the state regulatory agency at this time.
So before the show, I had asked who has the facts and figures on this, so feel free, anybody who wants to jump in. The portfolio itself, the Somerville Retirement Board manages a portfolio of about $250 million for the retirees of the city. Less than 2% of that is involved with fossil fuels. I guess from a layman's standpoint, what is the resistance to divesting that less than 2% of the portfolio?
Yeah, so it's around 2% is invested in the top 200 fossil fuel companies, and the specific ask is to divest from those companies. there's a little more at other companies. What is a fossil fuel company depends, because there's plenty of companies that own maybe some fossil fuels or whatever it is. I think that they are cautious about making any move for non-financial reasons, and the argument that we want to make to them is that there's very good financial reasons to divest from fossil fuels. And so what we've seen is a report that came out this year showing that the California pension system lost $5 billion over in fossil fuel stocks over the last year. The Massachusetts state system lost $500 million, and we've asked Somerville to look into how much they lost. And we've seen a number of studies on this, so this is not something where we don't know what's going to happen with the investments. Generally speaking, there have been a number of studies in the literature, financial studies, on the effects of taking into account social factors in investing. And I have a review here from the investment firm Mercer. They looked at 20 studies on this. They found that, 13 of the studies found positive effects, 10 found positive effects, 13 neutral, or 7 neutral, only 3 of them found negative effects. So generally the literature has shown these sorts of things can improve investments. And in fossil fuels in particular, 3 studies by the Aperio Group, 1 by Impacts Asset Management, 1 by MSCI, which is a former subsidiary of Morgan Stanley, have all found that in the last 1, 3, 5, and 7 years, a fund without fossil fuels would have done better. And they've all recommended that divesting can actually help with dealing with volatility of the energy sector. And then, of course, in the long term, we know that as we start to deal with climate change, we know that in current trends, we're going to exceed the limits of carbon we can release within about 16 years. So this is something, it's not a long-term problem so much, it's something we have to start doing something about soon. And as we start to enact policies that reduce fossil fuel usage, that's going to be bad for the industry. So what we've seen is in recent years, fossil fuels have not been good investments, and there's no real reason to think they're going to be in the future. So we actually think there's a very strong financial argument for divestment.
So I would not expect you to be an advocate for investing in fossil fuels if they were giving big payoffs. But I guess, again, it goes back to the layman's question. Aren't there other stocks that would get a better return for the retirement board other than fossil fuels?
Yes, I think so.
The answer is yes. I mean, I have a very small, I don't have a $250 million portfolio, but you're very careful where your stocks are being allocated. So let's go back to, one of the other questions that I had, let me just go to my note for 1 second, is the governing authority for the Somerville Retirement Board is not necessarily the Massachusetts retirement system.
Right.
But the Massachusetts Retirement Board actually kind of lays out the guidelines for all of the retirement boards, whether they're similar to Somerville or they're a group of. The Massachusetts Retirement Board right now is considering a bill at the State House for divestment. Somebody want to take that?
Yeah, the bill's been in the State House for, I think, about 1.5 years now. I think it's currently sort of just sitting in committee and not moving forward super proactively. I think that is something that the Somerville Retirement Board in particular has been looking toward to see what's going to happen at the state level.
Let me put you on the spot, Samantha. Are they playing a waiting game? Are they waiting to see?
I think to a degree, yes. Yeah.
So the Somerville Retirement Board, a little skittish about litigation from their retirees, is saying, well, if the state is going to do this anyway, why take the leap? I mean, that's an opinion. You don't have to agree with it, but that's
right.
what I'm seeing.
And the thing that is interesting to think about when you mention litigation from a retiree, I think we would argue that someone could bring litigation for not divesting. If these,
Yes.
as Eric just described, as these investments start to do poorly, as we move to a clean energy economy and people, these stock prices continue to go down, and they had this knowledge, they had these studies that
Can't say it wasn't foreseeable.
Exactly,
Yeah.
and I think that's something to consider too. Is on the opposite side of, well, someone could bring litigation for not divesting.
Right. Joe, when you think about the organization that you're part of, what gives you hope that it will be successful in the next 3, 5, 10 years? Specifically because as far as I know, no city or town has completely divested.
I would say that the level of support that we have gotten both from elected officials and the general community is really heartening. So we see that the will is there. People are connecting with and understanding our arguments, but there are kind of hurdles that we need to overcome. But I think it wouldn't be there wouldn't be a need for a grassroots movement like ours if it was such an easy path. And so I think it requires the commitment both of us who are most directly involved, but more generally the broader community. So I think what kind of gives me hope for success is how much progress we've made. Sometimes it can seem slow, and especially in the face of such a dramatic problem, it can seem slow. But real progress has been made, and so I think that the end is in sight.
And you do have museums and not-for-profit organizations and other entities that have divested in their own portfolio.
Well, the state of California and the University of California system. So some big foundations, big governments have divested.
When you talk about the divestment movement, and you had alluded to apartheid in South Africa and the tobacco industry, they fought tooth and nail to stop divestment. Who's more powerful? Anybody can take this. Who do you think was more powerful, the tobacco industry that fought tooth and nail, or the big energy companies that are fighting this tooth and nail?
I think the energy companies.
Yeah.
Yeah, and part of the goal of the divestment movement is that those companies need to be seen the same way as tobacco companies, and that this is a rogue industry whose business model is not acceptable. And it's not acceptable that they're spending millions of dollars a year lobbying Congress against policies that we need to deal with climate change. And I think that one of the things about the tobacco industry is at this point, they're seen in a pretty bad light. They've been discredited. And we still have a bit of a ways to go, I think, on the oil industry, although, they're not viewed very positively, but they have a lot more money.
And I think that's why divestment is so important. Obviously there's a million different solutions to climate change, and many of them are well worth pursuing, and we should be, tackling this problem on a number of fronts. But the fact is, the fossil fuel companies have made it very clear that they have no intention of, being a general energy company and pursuing renewable energy sources. I know Shell and BP in particular have, at some point had that line where we're, BP used to be beyond petroleum, and looking at all these different energy sources and investing R&D in that, and they've totally stopped doing that. So they've made it perfectly clear that they are just sticking with the fossil fuels, and not to mention the fact that they spent literally decades spending so much lobbying Congress and actively deceiving the public in terms of the climate science, publishing their own bogus science, and I think those two things in particular just make it so clear where they're at, and so we need to use divestment to send the message of this is not a socially acceptable thing to be
One of the
doing.
things, if I remember correctly, Samantha, is that the tobacco industry had a foe, a very, very powerful foe in the health industry, that the medical industry fought the tobacco industry and said, your science is wrong. Here's why. Does the divestment, the fossil fuel divestment industry organizations, do they have any kind of alliance?
Yeah, I think we have lots of alliances, scientific groups. I mean, a number of scientific organizations and medical organizations have endorsed divestment, and of course, more generally, have said we need to do something about climate change. But there's also alliances being made with labor unions. There's, for example, I think SEIU 888 and 509 in Massachusetts, and the Massachusetts Teachers Association. They all endorse divestment at the state level. And there's connections being made with First Nations groups in Canada around the tar sands oils, and Native groups in the U.S. So I think there's one of the great things about the climate movement right now is there are a lot of connections being made between different causes and different groups, and it's building a constituency for a movement towards a sustainable infrastructure.
Let's stay with that just for 1 minute, and then I'm going to look to our director and see. There was a documentary that you guys had spoken about, and we're going to see if we can run that in a little bit. But when you speak about outreach, your efforts over the last 3 to 4 years here in the City of Somerville, you've done your petitioning, you've gone to see the Board of Aldermen, the mayor is behind what you're doing. How about the retirees themselves? Do you think that the retirees understand what your movement is about and what benefit and do no harm it would be if they got the retirement board to divest?
I would say so. So there was a letter that was submitted to local news sources like the Somerville News, Somerville Times, and it was signed by members of the retirement system. And so our outreach with that specific community, I mean, there's always more that we could do, but the people we have been able to connect with, I would say have connected with the message itself. But in terms of the broader retirement community, I do think there's something to be said for more concerted outreach.
It's one of the challenges we have is how do you reach retirees? There's no list of all the people who work for the city or are retired. They work in different workplaces across the city. So, we've done what we can to try and talk to people. We have some retirees who support our group very strongly. But as far as, we would love to have a chance to talk to more retirees and hear from them, give them information, that sort of thing. But how you reach people, it's a bit of a challenge. So hopefully some are watching this.
A lot of the very good point. Hopefully we'll
Yeah.
watch that Air Live program because the retirement board itself, I think their duties and their responsibilities are the fiscally sound investment for the retirees, make sure the checks and the payments and the disbursements are done
Yes.
on
Right.
time. Many of those retirees have moved. They're out of state. Quite frankly, thank God for the internet because they may be able to see this, but the board itself really doesn't have any kind of meetings, or they publish things and send them like any financial advisor would, or any pension company would. So I think they want me to keep talking here for a little bit. We're going to try to get that clip in a
We're ready to
second.
go to tape.
All right, let's go to it now. Thank you.
Our most important climatologist, Jim Hansen, had his team at NASA do a study to figure out how much carbon in the atmosphere was too much. The paper they published, maybe the most important scientific paper of the millennia to date, said we now know enough to know how much is too much. Any value for carbon in the atmosphere greater than 350 parts per million is not compatible with the planet on which civilization developed and to which life on Earth is adapted. That's pretty strong language for scientists to use. Stronger still if you know that outside today, the atmosphere is 395 parts per million CO2 and rising about 2 parts per million per year. Everything frozen on Earth is melting. The great ice sheet of the Arctic is reduced by more than half. The oceans are about 30% more acidic than they were 30 years ago because the chemistry of seawater changes as it absorbs carbon from the atmosphere. And because warm air holds more water vapor than cold, the atmosphere is about 5% wetter than it was 40 years ago. That's astonishingly large change.
There's more energy coming in and being absorbed by the Earth than there is heat being radiated to space, which is exactly what we expected, because as we add greenhouse gases to the atmosphere, it traps heat. Now we can measure that, and that's the basis by which we can prove that the human-made impacts on atmospheric composition are the primary cause of the climate change that we're observing.
So let's get to work. We're calling this Do the Math, and we're going to do some math for a moment. Just 3 numbers, okay? I wrote about them in a piece last summer for Rolling Stone, a piece that went oddly viral. It was the issue with Justin Bieber on the cover, okay? But here's the strange thing. The next day, I got a call from the editor saying, your piece has gotten 10 times more likes on Facebook than Justin Bieber's, Some of that is doubtless the result of my sort of soulful stare, but mostly it's because we managed to just kind of lay out this math in a very straightforward way that people needed to understand as we were going through what turned out to be the hottest year that America has ever experienced. Before we get to those 3 numbers, here's where we are so far. We've burned enough coal and gas and oil to raise the temperature of the Earth 1 degree. What has that done? There was a day last September when the headline in the paper was, "Half the polar ice cap is missing." Literally. I mean, if Neil Armstrong were up on the moon today, he would look down and see half as much area of ice in the Arctic. We've taken one of the largest physical features on Earth and we have broken it. Shall we work through the numbers? They're 3, and they're easy. The first one's 2 degrees. That's how much the world has said it would be safe to let the planet warm. In political terms, it's the only thing that anybody's agreed to. Some of you may remember that climate summit in Copenhagen. There was only one number in the final 2-page voluntary accord that people signed. Only one number in it, 2 degrees. Every signatory pledged to make sure the temperature wouldn't rise above that. The EU, Japan, Russia, China, countries that make their money selling oil like the United Arab Emirates, the most conservative, recalcitrant, reluctant countries on Earth, even the United States. If the world officially believes anything about climate change, it's that 2 degrees is too much. Second number, scientists have calculated how much carbon we could pour into the atmosphere and have a reasonable chance of staying below 2 degrees. They say about 565 more gigatons. A gigaton is 1 billion tons. That's not a perfect chance. That's worse odds than Russian roulette, you know. It sounds like it should be a lot. It is a lot. 565 billion tons of CO2. The problem is we pour 30 billion tons a year in now, and it goes up 3% a year. Do the math, and it's about 15 years before we go past that threshold. So that's sobering news. But the scary number is the third number. The third number was the important one and the new one, and it came from a team of financial analysts in the United Kingdom. And what they did was sit down with all the annual reports and SEC filings and things and figure out how much carbon the world's fossil fuel industry, how much they had already in their reserves. And that number turned out to be 2,795 gigatons worth of carbon. 5 times as much as the most conservative governments on Earth think would be safe to pour into the atmosphere. It's not even close. I mean, it's 5 times more. And once you know that number, then you understand the essence of this problem.
So there you go. Do the math. Do the math. Let's talk about what the math was in that short documentary. Somebody want to take it, Eric?
Sure. So what the math comes down to is that we can only burn about 20% of the currently known and held fossil fuel reserves in the world and stay within internationally accepted limits themselves that are already dangerously close to being too high.
You're talking about that 2%.
Yeah,
Keep
the
it below.
2 degrees warming.
Right.
Yeah, so 2 degrees Celsius warming is what the world has agreed to, compared to pre-industrial levels. And so we can only run about 20% of known fossil reserves and stay under that. And what that means is 80% has to be kept in the ground, which means we can't wait till they run out. We have to make the decision to not burn them. And this is part of where the divestment movement comes from, is essentially if you look at the fossil fuel industry's business plans, their financial reports, these sorts of things, they're not taking into account that they don't get to burn all the reserves that they own, that they've already invested money in finding and building the infrastructure to extract and all that sort of thing. And that's very dangerous for the planet. It's also dangerous financially because they have assets that they can't realize a return on, that they're currently expecting that they're going to. And people call that the carbon bubble. It's a big market bubble caused by the fact that these companies have put billions of dollars into finding these reserves, building the infrastructure to extract them. Now they own them, but they're not going to ever be able to realize profits on them. And that's the financial danger that we see coming forward. On the political side, what we know is that this industry plans to burn as much of it as we'll let them. And currently, Somerville is a part owner of that industry by owning stocks. And our money is going to support that business model, and then all of the lobbying money and all that they do to try and maintain their business model and to realize as much of those profits as they can. And that's what we're saying is not okay.
The retirement board, City of Somerville Retirement Board, depends on its financial advisors. Is there anything that would prohibit the City of Somerville Retirement Board from getting rid of those advisors who are advising them to put some of their investments into fossil fuels and get green advisors?
I mean, the board can choose whichever fund managers they want. It was actually interesting. I attended one of the board's meetings recently, and they had one of their fund managers give their annual report on how they had done over the last year or what have you. And because the board's been dealing with divestment, one of the board members asked this manager about, was this a possibility, or what was sort of this woman's thoughts on that. And it was really interesting because she said that, and this was a smaller firm, not a, big Merrill Lynch or whatever. It was a pretty small firm. And she said that on a weekly basis, she was hearing from her clients or from, someone in her field asking about this. So I think that the industry is definitely something that they are looking at, and there aren't a ton of just fossil-free funds available right now, but I would be surprised if that does not change very quickly. And, even this smaller firm was definitely very well aware of the issue and definitely going to look into it. So,
I think sometimes the criticism that's out there is that you can't touch anything in this world without some trace of a fossil fuel creating that. Mm-hmm. So the lights that are powering our studio, the buses that you take to get here, the linoleum on the floor, I mean, we understand what the organization is trying to do. How do you combat that type of criticism when you hear it?
Well, we say that that's what we're trying to change. But the issue is that we have a whole society that's built on a fossil fuel infrastructure, right? So that means that there are things we can do as individuals to be more green, but we can't completely solve the problem in ourselves as individuals. If we want to get to work, stay warm in the winter, all the basic things we need to survive, we rely on fossil fuels. But that's because we live in a society that's built upon that infrastructure. So that has to be a social decision. It can't be an individual decision. And right now, one of the major things that's preventing the decisions we need to move towards that non-fossil fuel infrastructure is the big lobbying dollars of the fossil fuel industry and the huge influence they have. They're one of the three biggest lobbies in Washington, and they have approximately 2 lobbyists per member of Congress, all that. And so what we need to do is break their power, and that's part of what the divestment movement is about, is making a statement to that industry saying we don't support this business model. It's the City of Somerville saying we're not going to take fossil fuel profits, we're not going to take their money. Why are you, to the member of Congress who takes their lobbying dollars, that sort of thing. So, that's part of what the movement is about, is to move towards a society where we don't rely on fossil fuels for all these basic things that we need.
It's interesting, earlier in the conversation, we had spoken about some of the organizations, the museums, the not-for-profits, the universities, when they do divest, and sometimes their portfolios actually go up. Depending on where they've taken the money out of fossil fuels and they put it into something else, and their dividends and their profit rises. Mm-hmm. Do we have any kind of example of that that's closer to home? Any municipality or any university or?
Well, I don't think it's been long enough for any organization that has divested to quite track that yet.
There are funds out there that are fossil free, and you can look at their returns, and like any other class of funds, some do better than others. Some of them are trying to track indexes like the S&P 500, and they do quite well tracking those without fossil fuels. Others are more actively managed funds, and of course there's other things that go into deciding which stocks they buy that determine how well they do. I'm not sure specifically about universities around here and how their portfolios have done. I don't know about hypothetical market studies that look at portfolios that are matched other than the fossil fuels, where the non-fossil fuel ones do slightly better. Yeah,
I didn't mean to sidetrack you and going back, but it keeps going through my mind that we are faced with a decision, and the decision is a question about our morals, a question about our future, or a question about financials and immediate gratification and survival. One cannot help but think that the retirees in the City of Somerville, who are, and I use this phrase in my other shows, no longer at peak earning capacity. They are retirees. They are dependent on their pension. They're dependent on their Social Security. And it's frightening for them to think that the portfolio could take a hit by divesting from fossil fuels. But then there is the age group that you're representing, saying, we're going to have kids, we're going to have grandkids. Whether I should have stated right at the beginning of the show that, if you don't believe in global warming or climate change, turn the channel, because, even folks my age, I mean, the facts are there, it's evident. The mood swings that the weather is having these days, you can't ask for a better example of what we as a society are doing to our climate, what we are doing to this earth. So I didn't mean to get off of why climate change is such a scary thing it's scary to me, but it is scary to younger folks who keep thinking to themselves, where do we go from here? That is not a bottomless well, so to speak, when it comes to the reserves that are in the earth. Why are we not investing in solar, in geothermal, in wind? I mean, those are the types of things that we're asked on a daily basis. But then you have the little dollar signs in the back of people's heads saying, it's scary to make that kind of change. Let's go into a couple of more things, and we have some time left. I'm going to ask Samantha to talk a little bit more about some of the organizations that are out there nationally that the local movement looks toward for direction.
Yeah, I mean, there's a number of organizations. The divestment movement in particular has been led largely by an organization called 350.org. Bill McKibben, who you saw in the video, he's their founder, and that's definitely, they've done a lot of work to bring a lot of organizations together, and I think they've been really effective in organizing campaigns that are really inspiring and really specific. They led the campaign against the Keystone XL pipeline and did a really good job of organizing a broad coalition of organizations to come together for that. So I think they've definitely been a leader, but there are too many to name for sure.
And I think that's really one of the strengths of the divestment movement, is that it was able to coalesce a lot of different groups' energies towards a tangible result and an achievable result. So there have been people working in the environmental movement for years and years, but with the divestment movement specifically, we were able to pinpoint kind of something that could be achieved. So it's one thing to say we want to stop climate change, which is kind of our broader overarching goal, but how do you measure that? Where do you begin? And so I think 350 has been able to kind of spearhead a way, and then the environmental groups that already existed are able to play a supplementary role, or a complementary role, not necessarily supplementary.
Right, and that's the beauty of divestment, as Joe said, is that anybody, no matter who you are, you have a connection to, whether it's your church, whether it's your city, whether it's your school. There are so many organizations that we're connected to, and that you can ask to divest or ask to examine these issues for your own micro community within even Somerville. There's so many different organizations that could be and are looking at divesting. So.
On a national, stay with it from a national scale, there's also pressure that is put on, not just, here are the facts, this is why it's a good thing for you to do it, it's morally the right thing for you to do it. There's also pressure put on certain organizations to maybe ask a board member to step away because of their involvement with fossil fuel. One of the things that's coming to mind is the Smithsonian. The Smithsonian has one of the Koch brothers on the board, and there's now a movement to get him to step away. Anybody want to talk about some of those tactics that could be used?
I think the idea is that, as a board member, this person is representing your organization, and I think there have been some discussions also about these individuals giving, large donations to these, nonprofits or whatever, and that I think is not as much of an issue because their donation doesn't necessarily, they're not restricting it to go to these, anti-climate things or anything. It's not affecting what the museum is putting out there necessarily, but I think it's more a symbol of you're representing this organization and you are wrecking the planet on one side and the board of the Natural History Museum on the other side. It just doesn't really reconcile very well.
There's a little bit of a disconnect there.
Absolutely, absolutely.
I mean, but I think it points to a more basic issue about democracy in our society, is that these people have these positions of influence because they have money, and we have a society where people who have money have much more influence. And those people, as a class, many of them, have a stake in the fossil fuel industry. There are far more rich people who have a stake in the fossil fuel industry than renewable energy. So it has a power base in our society, whereas renewables don't so much. And that's part of the issue that we're dealing with, right? Is that's part of the resistance to measures that we need to fight climate change, is that there's a base with power representing the fossil fuel industry, and people who want to see these measures for climate change are regular people like us, but there's not a base of power and profit around that. And so that's one of the challenges we face.
So we'll go back to, if you don't have the money to get what you want, there's always politics, and it's the politics of dancing. Fortunately for the City of Somerville, there doesn't seem to be any dissenting voice when it comes to your organization. We have state senators, we have state representatives, a mayor, the Board of Aldermen, many of the other climate action change. We have an Office of Environment and Sustainability that the mayor has set up here in the city. So where do we go from here? From the state standpoint, there is a bill that seems to be languishing to try to, get the Massachusetts retirement system to divest. We have a very cautious Somerville retirement board that doesn't want to get its feet or its hands slapped for making the wrong move. Where does the organization go from here?
I think as an entity, we just had a strategy session not too long ago where we tried to delineate what our immediate goals, intermediate goals, and longer term goals are. So really our most immediate focus is continuing to work with the Somerville Retirement Board and current retirees and present city workers to continue to try to achieve municipal divestment. That's kind of our reason for existence at this moment, but we do have a longer term perspective where if and when divestment at the city level is achieved, where our energies can be put to best use. But I think, speaking for myself and also for the organization, the Somerville Retirement Board is the locus of our focus for right now. I didn't try to make that rhyme, but I did.
You did, and you did a great job with it. Samantha, any final thoughts that you have?
I think that's one great thing about living in Somerville is, as you said, the city has a number of really impressive initiatives going on. They have Mayor Cortoni has a goal of being carbon neutral by 2050. I know his commission is currently working on a residential energy efficiency program as well as a residential solar program. There's also talk of community choice aggregation, which is basically a way of us buying our electricity as a city and getting a higher rate of renewables. So, there's just so many exciting things going on. So I think it's a really good time to be living in Somerville and working on these issues. So, I think we would hope to help out with some of those in the future. And, we already are to an extent. So.
All right, now I have to be very careful here because I think I'm about to anger all three of you, but the heating source for my home happens to be home heating oil. And I looked into, not because not my choice at all. That was there when I inherited this house. So it was a fairly new system, primarily because my late dad did not like gas, because he came from a time frame when houses blew up because of gas. So the new oil system got put in. I did look into converting to natural gas, and then it made no sense to me. It's still a fossil fuel. Yep. So I guess, help me wade through my own personal dilemma here of when I go from a fossil fuel, what's the best route for me to take? I have friends who tried geothermal.
In terms of transitioning your own home use away?
Well, yeah. Help me with it now, Joe.
I think that one of the traps we need to avoid falling into is the Jimmy Carter route of wear a sweater.
Wear a sweater.
But I mean, I think Eric had really laid it out well before, where there's certainly something to be said for living your life in a way that kind of accords with your individual values, but you also live within a broader structure that you aren't necessarily able to change on your own. So, I mean, we're not asking anybody to go cold in the winter, but I think if you want to live your values that value the environment, you could join our meetings, which are on Tuesdays from 7 o'clock until 8 o'clock. But yeah, that's my
I
take
completely
on it.
agree. I mean, this is definitely my personal opinion, but I care much less about what you're doing in your home. I don't really care that you drive a Hummer or whatever. I really care that you're active and that you're engaged in your community and that you're, educating yourself and your neighbors. To me, that's where you can make much greater of an impact than recycling or whatever. I mean, not that any of those things are bad, but I'd rather you, like Joe said, join our committee than buy a hybrid.
But I can tell you that none of my stock portfolio is in fossil fuels, so I feel good about that. Eric?
Yeah, I agree with everything they've said. My house is electric, but when I turn that electric on, unfortunately, it's being powered by coal. Doesn't have to be, and we need to move towards a society where it's powered by solar and wind and all those things. But that involves building a movement because I think we're not going to move towards that society quick enough without everyday people getting involved and putting pressure on their leaders to do the right thing.
So here's a suggestion from somebody who has a few years on you. I think your movement needs to get a hold of the Koch brothers. And you need to convince them that alternative energy is where they should start investing. Can you imagine the billions of dollars those two could throw into solar and wind and geothermal and all the rest of it that's out there? So the organization does have a website. You have a website.
Yes, fossilfree.org.
Yeah.
Or fossilfreesomerville.org, excuse me.
There's a lot of great information on there,
Yeah.
as well as ways to contact us, resources, links to financial studies, environmental information, all that. We'd really encourage people to go read it and check out that information and get in contact with us if you want to know more or get involved.
Yeah, terrific. Do you meet on a monthly basis or
Weekly basis, actually.
Weekly basis.
But we're happy to find ways for people to be involved at whatever level of involvement they can do. So if you can't come to a meeting every week, that's fine. You can still be involved. We'll find something.
And actually, a great opportunity to become involved. We're sponsoring a movie screening this coming Sunday, November 22nd, I believe, at the First Church in Cambridge. First Parish Church in Cambridge. It'll be the documentary This Changes Everything, which is based on a book by Naomi Klein, who was a partner with Bill McKibben on the Do the Math speaking tour. So it's not a direct sequel, but it's kind of a spiritual sequel to the Do the Math documentary.
And we'd love to see people there. Come talk to us now that you know what we look like.
Yeah, there you go. There you go. And what's the date again? I'm sorry.
It's Sunday, November 22nd.
The 22nd
Sunday.
Over at First Church?
Yep.
In Harvard Square.
Yeah,
In Harvard
on
Square.
Garden Street.
Yeah, terrific. Well, you guys have been terrific guests. I want to thank you for coming into Dead Air Live.
Yeah, thank you for having us.
Yeah, thank you for hosting
They're
us.
telling me I maybe have 2 minutes left. How about we talk about the weather? Let's talk a little bit about the weather. All three of you are Somervillians.
Yeah.
Honorary Somervillians. You weren't born here, you're honorary Somervillians. You went through last winter.
Yeah.
We did.
So-
Talk about your experience.
Well, it was awful. I'm from Tennessee, which is a warmer place, and there's no time I miss it more than in the middle of January. We have this unfortunate situation in Somerville where if you look at climate maps from last winter, and they're shaded according to how cold it was compared to the average, most of the world is red, and that it's warmer than average, and Somerville is this blue. Not Somerville, but the Northeast is a blue spot. So
No, I think it was just Somerville last year.
so the world is getting warmer, and we don't even get the small benefits.
And we're
of that.
escaping
Yeah.
from it. Huh?
It's we're getting the worst of both worlds.
Yeah. You live on the border with another country, though. You're on the border with Cambridge
true.
over there.
I do, but luckily I'm on the
You're on the
correct
Somerville
side,
side.
the correct side of the line.
That's right.
But I am a likely ambassador to people from the other side, so
go.
that's why we do have, not exclusively because of me, but we have affiliations with groups that operate in Cambridge and Boston as well.
Yep.
So we're quite the diplomats.
Yes.
The one thing I did forget to mention is that your petition is still up online, powered by, I think it's a WordPress. It's a WordPress.com or one of the organizations.
It's on gofossilfree.org, which is the website of kind of the international divestment movement. Our petition is there. It's linked from our website,
Okay.
so it should be easy to find.
Okay. So the folks out there in Somerville, if you're still looking for the organization's website, check it out. Just Google it. I mean, I do that. I just Google everything.
There you go.
So, feel free to contact any one of our guests tonight. Feel free to sign the petition. Next time you're talking to the mayor, thank him, the Board of Aldermen, thank them for supporting this organization, Fossil Free Somerville. Charlie, I think we're going to wrap up, if that's okay with you. He wants me, this means stretch it out, Joe, stretch it out.
Keep going.
I tried talking about the weather.
Well, actually, just a point that I wanted to make earlier and didn't get a chance to, an analog between the tobacco companies and the fossil-free companies. There was overwhelming evidence for decades that smoking caused lung cancer, and they were able to trot out scientists and doctors that were funded by the tobacco companies,
By the
saying
industry,
that it was
sure.
actually healthy, or that any connection to disease was incidental. And really, at this stage, I would also agree that the evidence that climate change is a man-made phenomenon is overwhelming, and there are still industry-funded groups that are claiming that's not the case. So
Yep. Yeah.
it's kind of,
It's amazing.
it really
It
is.
is really
Power
amazing.
of money.
Yeah.
We're done. They were just